Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C. It's the 14th of December, 2012. Two items here at the beginning of the broadcast. We will be dedicating a lot of our time today to the return to the class struggles of the 1930s. We're going to talk about the danger of domestic U.S. fascism and how we have to see this, not so much in Central European terms from the 1930s, but in somewhat different terms, maybe the ones more typical of the U.S. and France in the 1930s. Certainly we've got to talk about union busting, the fascist union busting of Governor Snyder of Michigan and his cabal of Republican state legislators, Tea Party fanatics, agents of the Koch brothers, and so forth, and a union-busting rampage after Wisconsin and Indiana was defeated in Ohio. Notice, could still be defeated in Michigan. Got to talk about the Taft-Hartley Act and how that has to be repealed. And we've got to talk about killer austerity, since Obama has now offered $200 billion more in killer cuts, genocidal austerity, to placate the fascist Boehner. So Obama's also reducing his demand for tax revenue by $200 billion. And I suppose some of that would have come out of the pockets of the super rich. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about essentially the new Czechoslovakia. In other words, what the Nazis did to Czechoslovakia in 1938, within a period of a couple of weeks and months, is being done by NATO to Syria, with the goal being to break up the country. But just remember that once you get something like that, a world war may not be far behind. That was the lesson of 1938 to 1939. This is the main substance of the broadcast. But now, at the beginning, emergency, we have the death squads in Syria apparently advancing. This, again, is not known with any systematic certainty, but the overall impression, trying to cut through the hype and the vacillation of some, that looks like the death squads have at least made some short-term gains in the last couple of weeks. Let's not think that it's going to end anytime soon. There's still plenty of time for countermeasures. But we've got the death squads. The Free Syrian Army has now kidnapped people and are holding them hostage. They want money, and if not, they're going to execute foreign citizens. And this is the Free Syrian Army that Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Obama, along with Hollande and Cameron and the rest of them, are telling us should be the government of Syria. The death squads should take over the country, they say. Well, let's look at what the death squads are up to. We have Anhar Kochneva. It's spelled Anhar Kochneva. She is a Ukrainian journalist in Damascus. I met her last November at a demonstration, and then this was a demonstration in the square of the railway station. And you recall, I had a chance to say a few words to a crowd of 50 or 60,000 people or more there. She was there covering that demonstration, and Russian-speaking Ukrainian journalist there. Now, she has been kidnapped. I was unaware of this, but Anna Kochneva was apparently kidnapped by the death squads somewhere north of Damascus 6 to 8 weeks ago. This is was something I learned of just yesterday. And if you look at RT, Russia Today, they have made this story prominent. And yesterday, the 13th of December, I put out a whole bunch of tweets and other calls. We have got to do something to save the life of Anhar Kochneva, and also to make people aware this case is not isolated. This is typical. The case is a humanitarian case of the first magnitude, and it shows the terrorist Al-Qaeda essence of the forces that the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice and Fabius and Haig and Cameron are all supporting. They want to install them as the government of Syria. So we've got massive complicity with Al-Qaeda terrorism, and these people are violating all kinds of laws. And as I pointed out on Press TV this week, this is where Obamagate could emerge, but we'll get to that later. Right now, what you've got to do, it's time to act. Mobilization. Commentary is cheap. If commentary does not turn into action, it's useless. Less talk, more action. Of course, action can sometimes be also, verbal intervention. It doesn't have to be anything outside of the political sphere, which is where we choose to operate. You've got to go to Twitter. You've got to register for Twitter. Anybody can register for Twitter. Anybody who can read and write can register for Twitter. You get on there and put out tweets saying it's time to free Anhar Kochneva, time to save her life. She's being held by death squads, the so-called Free Syrian Army. They want $50 million. No, she's got to be freed. And the State Department and the Quai d'Orsay and the Foreign Office and the Farnezina and you know all the rest of them, the Auswärtiges Amt, all of them have got to be put on the spot. Why are you supporting terrorism? Why don't you speak out against terrorist bandits who are holding hostages? You don't just negotiate with them. You support them. You pay them. And now this week, as of this week, the United States recognizes a new gaggle of terrorists as the rightful government of Syria. That is the Syrian National Coalition, led by this guy Khatib, who is an agent of Royal Dutch Shell, a lobbyist, an executive for Royal Dutch Shell, coming from a family which traditionally serves as stooges and running dogs for the French imperial occupation of Syria, going back to the 1920s and the 1930s. You go to Voltaire Network, Voltaire Net, and you can see pictures of this, the current Khatib's grandfather, I believe, hobnobbing with French imperialist, colonialist, probably proto-fascist generals back in the 1930s. So it's time to raise a hue and cry. The NGO community, this case is so extreme that even the NGO community is, to a certain degree, letting itself be heard. Anhar Kochneva was a journalist. She often sent out photo reportages and other stories. Think about it, journalists. That could be you. You want to be held hostage? Remember all these American journalists captured, and what a hue and cry, and what a crime against humanity, and it was. But now, how about Anhar Kochneva? So Amnesty International has done something. You can go to the there's a Save Anhar, ANHAR, Save Anhar, all one word. That's on Twitter. Anhar Kochneva, Kochneva. You've got to do that right now. Do that in the break, or get your computer while you're listening. Multitask. Send out some tweets. Some of our tweeters, Igor Rasputin has done yeoman service, and some others. But it's time to get busy on that. That is the arena where you can act. Now, more broadly, the same death squad that is holding Anhar Kochneva, and this is the Free Syrian Army, allegedly now aligned with the Syrian National Coalition, which has been named as the official government of Syria by the NATO imperialists. They have now said that no Iranian, no Ukrainian, no Iranian will be, no Russian, no Ukrainian, no Iranian will be allowed to leave alive. So they want to kill foreign citizens. It's time for those countries to send troops. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with all of this at tarpley.net, tarpley.net, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. There will be actions in December in Washington, D.C. We need to have anti-austerity demonstrations. We did something, and I'll report about this later. We did intervene on Monday in New York, Washington, in Nebraska, and in Southern California. this taking part in the National Nurses United anti-austerity protests and injecting the indispensable programmatic content of the Wall Street sales tax, without which all of this is useless, right? Without which it's doomed to fail. It's morally edifying, but it won't work unless you say where the money should come from, and that is out of the pockets of the Wall Street zombie bankers and the hedge fund hyenas and the corsairs, the vulture capitalists of Wall Street. If you don't specify that, you cannot win. So keep up with all that. And again, we may have to call some kind of a demonstration here in Washington on short notice sometime in December, right? Sometime around the 20th to the 25th, when the full enormity of this is revealed, right? The extent to which Obama is selling you out behind the scenes, because that's what he's doing. We've got these signs, right? $200 billion more in killer cuts. In exchange for what? For nothing. He just gave it away, and $200 billion less in tax revenue, which is related, right? Because this does contribute to the solvency of the federal government. But now, the Anhar Kochneva story, you've got to get busy on that on Twitter. Go to Webster G. Tarpley. You'll find plenty of Twitters that you can then retweet and get in there. If you don't like mine, write your own. But if you don't know what to write, retweet what I've done. The other question then is, Russia, Ukraine, and Iran have been put on the spot by this death squad holding Anhar Kochneva. They've said that no Russian, no Ukrainian, and no Iranian will be allowed to leave Syria alive. And that threat has some substance, because it looks like the rebels have succeeded in at least disrupting from time to time the communications between Damascus and the airport. And I remember taking that drive just a little more than a year ago, right? The flights typically leave, the ones to the west, in the middle of the night. So what will Moscow, Kiev, and Tehran do? Now, when you have a situation like this, it is a well-established procedure under international law that if you've got a chaotic situation and if you've got thousands or tens of thousands of your nationals on the ground in a country and law and order breaks down, mayhem, chaos, killing emerges, you have every right, you actually have a responsibility under international law to send in your troops to assist in the evacuation of your nationals. It means to protect your nationals, to help them concentrate at certain points where they're going to be evacuated, and then to get them out of the country, right? The U.S. has sent in the Marines again and again and again. You may remember the invasion of Panama, let's say, in December of 1989, right around this very time of year, the first year of Mad Dog Bush the Elder, Mad Dog Bush the Elder in the White House. It was a case of a U.S. officer and his wife who had gotten roughed up at a checkpoint, and we saw Mad Dog Bush the Elder go on and say, when they molest the wife of an American officer, that's bad, bad. All right, so this is bad. You're holding Anhar Kochneva, you're going to kill her, and you're saying that no Russian, Ukrainian, Iranian is going to be allowed out of there alive? This is what the West supports? This is what NATO says should be the government? No. Time for Russia, Ukraine, Iran, other countries who have nationals there. China, maybe they have some people there. Time for a multinational humanitarian intervention. It's strictly limited. It's not to seize control of Syria, but it is to protect those nationals from being massacred. We're trying simply to prevent a bloodbath. This, however, would then put the NATO mad dogs into a situation. What are you going to do then? Are you going to say, oh, no, we insist under international law for the right of these killers, these lunatics, these Salafi characters. They're all paid by Saudi Arabia, right? They're all listening to that guy, Arur, that we insist, says NATO, on the right these people to run amok, right, against and hold hostages, and you take it from there. That's going to be hard for NATO, and that will, I think, pose this important question. So those governments, and there are many governments that are involved in this. There are 3 countries that are now under the gun. Also, it's actually more. There's Lebanon, too. We've got some Lebanese that are being held in Syria by death squads. And these death squads say, oh, no, those Lebanese are not just normal people. Those are from Hezbollah, so we're holding them and we're threatening to kill them, say the death squads that are doing this. So this is obviously a totally unacceptable situation. Notice that this past week, the United States recognized the Syrian National Coalition. Obama did this himself in an interview. He thinks that's now the legal government of Syria. And at just about the same day, the State Department, covering its posteriors, put out its own statement that al-Nusra, which is the umbrella organization for 29 of the main death squads, 29 terrorist brigades of al-Nusra, those are al-Qaeda affiliates, and they are sanctioned as terrorist entities. So anybody supporting them is guilty of aiding and abetting terrorism. Well, how about it, guys? If the State Department is supporting the Syrian National Coalition and the Free Syrian Army, and this is basically a euphemism for al-Qaeda and its ilk, then aren't you violating federal law? I smell OBAMAGATE bait, Hillary-gate bait, Rice-gate bait, I suppose. So here's the other thing, right? You want to intervene in this. Again, the emergency is the life of Anha Kochneva, who has to be liberated from these people. And there's also a way, as you're doing it, you're going to build awareness in the world that those are al-Qaeda terrorist killers, butchers. That's who they are. But at the same time, you want to go to the White House website and let your voice be heard. Now, I sent out a tweet about this. I put out all kinds of things. There is a petition on the We the People section of the White House website. So you just type in White House, We the People, Syria, and eventually you're going to get to it, and you want to sign it. Pull your gumption and guts together and put your name on there, because you have to register. You got to be a U.S. citizen. But don't be afraid. There are other people who are much more in danger than you. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Remember, keep up with everything at Webster G. Tarpley Twitter, minute to minute, hour to hour, and the big picture conceptually on Tarpley.net. And remember, Christmas gift-giving season is here. If you want to understand the world you're living in right now, you've got to get Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney, and the Mormon takeover of America with polygamy, theocracy, and subversion. And we saw it once again. We saw various people this week saying that it's time for the federal government to butt out of marriage. No way. The Moral Act of 1862 prohibits polygamy and other backup legislation from the second half of the 19th century. Polygamy is unacceptable. It is antithetical to modern civilization in all of its forms. And it opens the door to a whole array of really dramatic abuses. So you'll see all of that. That was Glenn Beck, I think, this week, actually. Glenn Beck, the Mormon activist, saying, let's get the federal government out of the question of marriage, right? He's following in the footsteps of the leprechaun, Ron Paul, who about a year ago was telling a bunch of Republicans in South Carolina it was time to deregulate marriage. No. And to understand why, take a look at Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney, and the Mormon takeover of America. So here's what you want to do. Anybody can do it. It's easy. Pull yourself together. Remember, there's nothing nothing to lose but your fear, right? You don't take counsel of your fears. You go to We the People. So it's petitions.whitehouse.gov, Anyway, you don't need all that. Just put in White House, We the People, and then it shows you open petitions. You scroll down, and you find it. If you want to get it directly, go to Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. You can just click on the link that I've included there. Let's just take a look at this. We petition the Obama administration to cease all funding and support for al-Qaeda terrorists and extremist rebels in Syria. Hillary Clinton has admitted that al-Qaeda is supporting the Syrian rebels, who are backed by the Obama administration with $200 million in aid. It goes further now. The State Department has recognized them as the legitimate government. According to McClatchy newspapers, one of these groups, al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, is now conducting the heaviest frontline fighting in Syria and has been responsible for terrorist attacks. Observers such as Jacques Beres say the majority of rebels in Syria are foreign extremists whose goal is to impose Sharia law. Now remember, Syria is a secular state, modern, status of women, okay, union rights, you have all that, right? Food subsidies, fuel subsidies, Sharia law, well, you see, you're going to have none of that. These rebels have also been filmed burning U.S. flags and chanting anti-American slogans. Indeed, many of the rebels in Syria are people who have their recent track record is killing American soldiers in Iraq. That's a very large group of them. Funding terrorists is a crime under the National Defense Authorization Act. Such activity has had disastrous consequences in the past, such as 9/11. Well, that's not really what happened with 9/11, but that's okay. We demand all support, direct or indirect, to cease immediately. So you can sign that. It's got to get, in order to get an official answer from Obama, it's got to get to 25,000 signatures. So the signatures are needed by January 6th. We have until January 6th of 2013, practically epiphany. That'll be a moment of epiphany. Does the American opposition, anti-imperialist opposition, have any guts, energy, intelligence left? Or has it all been sapped by the leprechaun and by Occupy? Here's something you can actually do. Right now, it's got 1,675 signatures, so we got to get 23,325 more. So, created by SV of Portland, Oregon. So that's the first signature. Get your name on there. That's going to be an honor roll, right? And you can look back and say, did I live? Did I accomplish anything? Well, if you sign this, then you did. All right. So those two things. Put out some Twitters for Anhar Kochneva and sign that petition. Now let's look at the. Let's continue with Syria since we're here. We'll wrap up Syria. The U.S. is sending Patriot missile batteries to the southern border of Turkey. This is signed by Panetta today, with 400 troops. This is a recipe for big trouble. It establishes a de facto no-fly zone. In other words, the range of these Patriot missiles allows them to shoot down aircraft, 100 miles or so into Syrian territory. There are also reports, I can't confirm them, that Syria has used Scud missiles against the death squads. David Ignatius today on NPR says that the Syrian opposition is still complaining that the U.S. does not do enough for them. In other words, al-Qaeda says they want more of your money. How do you like that? As we said, the State Department has conceded that al-Nusra is a terrorist organization, but still the rebels have gotten official recognition. And, of course, what we need to do, among other things, since Obama doesn't respond to anything except his own demagogic interests in the short run, this is all Obamagate bait. Obamagate bait. We're going to have a time coming soon, we'll talk about this more, when the question will be who lost Libya, who lost Syria, maybe who lost Egypt. You don't want to be in the way of that, Obama, and that's where you're headed. Back off. And the same thing goes for your friend, your telephone buddy, Erdogan. Back off. You're going to have a rebellion of the Kurds. You're going to have a rebellion of the Alawites. The Kurds are already fighting the death squads in northeast Syria. And let me also extend this to the Netherlands and to Germany that are somehow involved on this Patriot trip. But out. Time to get out of there. Germany has a traditional interest in Anatolia, right? We go to the Pergamon Museum in East Berlin and see the interesting remains of the Pergamon altar from central Anatolia. This is a way to get yourself hated and ejected, because you're going to be seen as an imperialist, and that is what you will be. So there's the Syrian emergency. And again, we hear from RT that Moscow is considering a move to evacuate their rather numerous nationals, and they might be joined by countries like Ukraine, Iran, or others. And that maybe that would clear the mind of the world community. But now, two things: the union-busting campaign and the savage austerity with Obama, again, adding $200 billion in killer cuts from Medicare and other entitlements. Let's tackle union-busting first. We're talking now about so-called right to work. This, by the way, this is a euphemism thought up by the Frank Luntz of an earlier generation, right? All of these terms, right? Fiscal cliff. There's no fiscal cliff. Job creators, those are rich parasites. Conservatives, those are not conservatives. Those are reactionaries and fascists. Right to work, that's called union busting. Entitlements, no. Those are your economic rights, and so it goes. So it's time to reform your vocabulary to tell the truth. And again, let's not get into the business ourselves, right? It's not single-payer health care. It's called Medicare for all, so everybody can understand. And we might as well, in the process, turn away from these terms like Robin Hood tax. This is very unfortunate, especially for the U.S., right? Maybe it works somewhere else. But it's called the Wall Street sales tax. But now let's get to the heart of the union-busting story here in the next segment. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed and Tarpley.net, indispensable in the season of struggle that we've now entered into. We have, in effect, turned back the clock to the naked class struggle of the 1930s. And this has been done by the financier oligarchs themselves. This has been done by the 1%. Union busting, killer austerity, this imperialist rampage against Syria. These are essentially fascist elements. We'll try to define that. Right now, focus is on Michigan. We've warned against Michigan. We've been focused on Michigan for quite a while. We were able, with the help of people like Reverend Pinckney in Benton Harbor, Michigan, to defeat the fascist Governor Snyder in his, what can we call it, his Little Hitler program of sending in emergency managers, austerity dictators, to take over Benton Harbor, Flint, Pontiac, Ecorse, the Detroit schools, and so forth. There was a constitutional referendum in November. Those were struck down. But at the same time, it proved to be impossible to secure the passage of a constitutional amendment in the Michigan State Constitution saying that the workers have the right to collective bargaining. So Snyder now taking advantage of that. Indeed, Snyder says it's your fault. He says, you Democrats, you union guys, you pushed that constitutional referendum to anchor trade union rights in the state constitution. That failed, and now my Republicans want to counterattack you, and there's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to sign the bill. And, of course, it's now law. So at the beginning of the year, we had 22 scab states, 22 union-busting states. Now we're up to 24. We've had Indiana with Mitch Daniels. He's now going to Purdue University, Perdue, meaning lost forever. And now we've got Governor Snyder. Notice that in Wisconsin there was something similar in regards to the public sector unions. That, has been an object of struggle. In Ohio, when it was a direct ballot question, the fascist Kasich was defeated on that. So maybe that shows the way. But Michigan, this is dramatic. This, of course, is where we had the big battles of the 1930s, the creation of the United Auto Workers, the creation of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. We had a hunger march in 1932 when the hunger march left the city limits of Detroit, got to the city limits of Dearborn, a little bit south. There were machine guns on the overpass, and there was shooting. And this was done by this guy, Harry Bennett, the fascist stormtrooper who was the head of the security goons for the Ford plants. And then again in the Battle of the Overpass, this was a march of the UAW this time to get union recognition, and there were a complete rampage by union goons. If you want to go back and get the ethos of those times, I urge you to read The Flivver King. The Flivver King, Flivver, it just means a car. The Flivver King by Upton Sinclair. This is a short historical novel about a family in Detroit from the 1890s into the 1930s, of 1940s, which essentially it is a balanced presentation of how Henry Ford essentially turned to fascism as a matter of labor relations over time, and it's a very readable short book. Deserves more attention. Upton Sinclair, The Flivver King. But now the United Auto Workers, right? The great sit-down strikes, Toledo Auto Light in Ohio, and the sit-down strikes in Detroit, 1936, 37. 38, leading to the recognition of the UAW, collective bargaining, and of course Ford was the last one to go for it. What is at stake now are the essential social conquests of the New Deal. The GI Bill of Rights tended to codify these things, to consolidate them. You have the right to own a home. You do. You have a right to go to college. These are points from the Roosevelt Economic Bill of Rights of January 1944, which was actually enunciated as part of the Atlantic Charter of 1941. Now, how did this happen? In the short term, on NPR today, we heard, the Wisconsin recall of the fascist Walker, that was too much, that was overreaching. No, that was perfectly in order. The problem there was if your candidate is that guy Barnett, the Democratic mayor of Milwaukee, that guy was pathetic. He didn't run on maintaining union rights. He ran on the namby-pamby Obama-speak sort of Wall Street Democrat pabulum that doesn't get you anywhere. The thing that I would point to is, notice in Wisconsin, the people who were trying to defend the public sector unions immediately gave up on all wage demands and all benefit demands. They just said, all we want is trade union recognition and collective bargaining. You can take away wages and benefits bargaining. So that looked very much like a stance which was good for the Democratic Party, who get the money, good for the trade union bureaucrats, but no good for the poor working stiffs who need those benefits. So that was the inherent weakness of Wisconsin from the very beginning, that they refused to fight on economic issues. And now in the case of the United Auto Workers, right, it started with Gettelfinger, and now we're down to this guy King, I believe. Here's what's wrong with them. When Obama saved, in quotes, the automobile industry, this was certainly, this was better than Romney, right? It was better than immediate bankruptcy, liquidation, and breaking it up and selling it off. But the concessions given by the UAW, which were that all new hires would be hired not at the union rates of Michigan, but that the new hires for the UAW would go down to the rates of Mississippi, the backward, benighted, reactionary climate of Mississippi, which is a right-to-work state, right? Everybody can see right-to-work states are poorer, they're more backward, it's more dangerous, there are fewer benefits, the wages are lower. This is the low-wage model. This will not work. The United States, historically, you're a conservative, you've got to recognize The whole history of the United States is higher wages. That was the draw. That was what made it attractive. Wages always higher. Constant labor shortage. Now, of course, under the Wall Street financier oligarchs of the last 20 years in particular, that advantage largely lost. We're essentially proceeding on the basis of absolute immiseration someplace else or a lot of illusions. But the low-wage model cannot work. How in God's name can you compete with China or Vietnam or Thailand? They can always go you one lower. You can't win the race to the bottom. So what you've got to realize is that high value added, high energy intensity, high capital intensity also requires a high wage economy, and that is the wave of the future. This entire low wage thing is a loser in its own terms. You cannot compete. You never will succeed with this. You're dooming yourself, and once you lose some of these things, you have lost them. But the reactionaries of the Midwest, now let's remember them. The area of the United States where support for Hitler and the Nazis was greatest was the Midwest. It's the automobile industry, Henry Ford in particular, but also Alfred P. Sloan and others there. I remember both of them had branches in Nazi Germany, so they were part of the Nazi cartel system, and there were all sorts of other reasons. It also has something to do with the fact that this kind of industry tends to generate this union-busting mentality, whereas something like lighter industries, electrical industries, even when they get rather heavy, those are somewhat different, right? Siemens in Germany, less interested in Hitler than some others. General Electric, less interested in the reactionaries even here. But we've criticized General Electric for what they do. So the weakness of the UAW grows out of the concessions that were extorted from them by Obama for the new hires who are now getting paid at a much lower wage level with far fewer benefits. They're essentially little islands of Mississippi in the middle of Michigan. That will not work. So this has got to change. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. With this combination, union-busting, killer austerity, and the new Czechoslovakia going on now in Syria, we're back to what looks very much like a new fascist era, very similar to the 1930s. And the forms of class confrontation are now reminiscent of those years. The problem is that the awareness of this has atrophied tragically in large areas of the population. Now, when I say class struggle, I think mainly in terms of Plato's class struggle, the people against the oligarchy, Machiavelli's class struggle, similarly, many against the few, but also with those caveats from Plato that pure democracy is not the answer, that some form of greater wisdom is required. But we're now looking at a kind of class struggle, which is now, it's a class aggression coming from these financier oligarchs. Now, let's look at just this question of fascism. Remember, the ruling class, Wall Street, wanted Romney. They wanted the Romney plan. And let's just remind you what that was, right? Remember, you got to look at this in Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion. This was Petraeus. This was the Gallup poll, apparently making this plausible. Other generals, right? You can look at those articles on Tarpley.net where we go through the various names. But it would have been one-party rule. In other words, vote fraud used to give the Republicans the White House, the Senate, and the House, then pack the Supreme Court. And remember, you've got to go back to the 1930s when you had the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? We know the Rats Cabal, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia with Kennedy. This is a disaster, but it could be even worse if we had more militant reactionaries. And you had 5 Scalias on the Supreme Court, then you would have a situation where legality would basically be over. We've just had Scalia's outbursts about gay marriage and his moral revulsion and so forth. Well, who cares about that? Public law, what counts, not your individual likes and dislikes there. Scalia, again, the guideline there is equal protection of the laws for everybody. That should be an open and shut case. But if the Supreme Court could be packed, which Romney would have done, you could then bust all unions and essentially go into a wild deregulation. Now, I would agree the Environmental Protection Administration has overreached. The stuff they're doing about global warming, I condemn. Their carbon tax, carbon CO limitations, I think this is all baloney. There is global warming, not anthropogenic, result of solar activity. We don't need a carbon tax. We don't need Waxman-Markey. That's the last thing we need. However, because of the excesses of the people pushing those things, it's now easier to attack things like child labor regulations, Pure Food and Drug Act, things of this sort that we do need. Antitrust has atrophied down to nothing. So the other question with the Romney plan was then after the one-party state, the packing of the Supreme Court, institutionalized vote fraud, bust all unions, wild deregulation, then restrict voting. And that would give you the functional equivalent of a fascist dictatorship. Remember, Mussolini, Hitler, two things that they did. When they came to power, they destroyed all unions. That is what fascism did. The reason fascist stormtroopers in a mass movement were necessary, the ruling class was willing to allow the gutter snipes and the plebeians to assume significant power, was because those were needed to destroy labor organizations and pro-labor parties in the streets. In some other countries like Britain and especially the United States, this dimension may not be necessary, and it's possible to imagine fascism, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, coming primarily through formally legal procedures, although with obviously a lot of illegality going on in the background. That was the Romney plan. Now, if we look at the program of the reactionary and pro-fascist oligarchy in the United States, here's a little quote. We've heard this before from the 1942 meeting of the National Association of Manufacturers. These are the people who wrote the Taft-Hartley Act, where this is, again, Lamont DuPont of the Liberty League, supporter of various native fascist organizations. You can find the quote in George Seldy's book, Facts and Fascism. He tells the secret meeting of the National Association of Manufacturers the following, quote, "What are the common denominators in winning the war and the peace? If there are, we should deal with both in 1943. What are they? We will win the war and the peace by reducing taxes on corporations." Well, 35% corporate income tax. Nobody pays it. Wall Street doesn't pay it. Obama wants to even lower it. Reduce taxes on corporations and high income brackets and increase taxes on lower incomes, says DuPont of the National Association of Manufacturers, 1942. Also, by removing the unions from any power to tell industry how to produce, how to deal with their employees, or anything else. So, smash all unions, the fascist program. C, destroying any and all government agencies that stand in the way of free enterprise. So, you got it. Shift the tax burden from the corporations and the wealthy and Wall Street onto the middle class and working people. Clear. Bust all unions and wild deregulation. Now, the Romney plan, essentially the same thing, but this thrust in the ruling elite, Wall Street and its tentacles, especially the Koch brothers and people like, the ALEC and Americans for Prosperity, as we saw this week. Their commitment in this direction remains strong. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act needs to be repealed. It was always a monstrosity. Let's just go through some of the history of this stuff. Labor relations in the U.S. Well, it starts, I guess, with the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And this was supposed to be to outlaw trusts, cartels, and other combinations, monopolies. Monopolies, trusts, and cartels were targeted. And it said you cannot have a conspiracy in restraint of trade. The problem is the courts then, the reactionaries, the skull and bones people in the courts, turned around and said, wait a minute, labor is a commodity, a union is a conspiracy in restraint of trade. And this led then to the use of the court injunction, government by injunction, always against labor, to try to shut down strikes. Therefore, the remedy that was partially provided was the Clayton Antitrust Act, 24 years later, 1914. Labor is not a commodity, so-called Magna Carta of labor. You cannot use antitrust laws against labor. You can have unions, you can have boycotts, interstate boycotts, you can have strikes, you can have picketing, you can have collective bargaining, and you can have strike benefits. So that's Clayton Antitrust. That's a step forward, 1914. Then we get the National Recovery Act, 1933. Now, there are problematic features of this law. It talks about trying to get rid of unfair competition. The main problem was that they were also attempting to limit production. This is never the right way to do it. However, under the NRA, certain progress was made, and we'll talk about this in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, labor relations. How did we get to this Taft-Hartley law? It's a monstrosity. We are against it. We want it repealed. But here's the question then. How did we ever get to have a union movement in the first place? It required at least the benevolent neutrality and often the support of forces inside the federal government. And this is the New Deal. Remember, up until the New Deal, you had two main forces on the national scene: the banks and the industries they controlled, cartels, monopolies, trusts, and the government. And it was a one-way street. The influence went from the banks into the government. The innovation of the New Deal is structural, that the mass organizations of working people, trade unions, labor unions, craft unions, all kinds, become a third leg of that stool and counterbalance to some extent the overweening power of Wall Street. Now, this is beyond individuals. People say, I don't like union leaders, I don't like their practices. Forget that garbage. That's for suckers and idiots. The main thing is a structural counterweight to what is otherwise the power of Wall Street. And remember, if you want to stop a fascist coup or totalitarian degeneration of the government, you can't do that without unions. They must be there, no matter how much contempt you may have for union bureaucrats. That is a waste of time. Just the fact that they're there is already an important step forward. And therefore, these institutions need to be promoted. Now, the National Recovery Act, along with its problematic features, had positive features. And what it did was it allowed, this is the NRA, right, the Blue Eagle, it allowed the president to essentially use executive orders to do things like this, what Roosevelt did in 1933, 1934. No child labor. We're still fighting this. We've got Senator Lee, the Mormon fanatic from Utah, who says that child labor laws are unconstitutional. This kind of benighted medieval Dark Ages lunacy. Roosevelt also decreed 35 hours a week in blue-collar industries, 40 hours a week in white-collar occupations, and a minimum wage. You want to know what the minimum wage was in 1933? 40 cents an hour. 40 cents an hour. And naturally, that was communism, right, from the National Association of Manufacturers and so forth. The other thing, then, is Section 7A of the NRA. This was a step forward for labor. Employees shall have the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing. They shall be free from interference, restraint, or coercion by employers of labor or their agents in the designation of such representatives or in self-organization or in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. 2, no employee, no one seeking employment shall be required as a condition of employment to join any company union or and will not be required to refrain from joining, organizing, or assisting a labor organization of his or her own choosing. 3, that employers shall comply with the maximum hours of labor, minimum rates of pay, and other conditions of employment approved or prescribed by the president. And I've just told you what some of those were. And some of these are still controversial. For the lunatic Lee out there in the wastes of Deseret, he thinks that the child labor laws are still unconstitutional. Now, Henry Ford refused to go along with any of this, and then we have the infamous Schechter-Poultry case. The National Labor Relations Board, however, was another step forward. The National Labor Relations Board was, on the whole, pro-labor in 1935, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse in the Supreme Court, the reactionary clique, overturned this in 1935. Now, the answer to that was then the Wagner Act, the Wagner-Connery. Actually, before that, there was the Guffey-Snyder Act of 1935. The Guffey-Snyder Act of 1935 tried to help the miners in the soft coal industry, bituminous coal miners. This tried to get them some minimum guarantees, wages, hours, conditions. This was also overturned by the four horsemen of the apocalypse in May of 1936. The litmus test for the Supreme Court has to go beyond what people think, right? Abortion, yes or no? Well, let's make it, are you an anti-union buster? Are you going to go along with this kind of stuff? Then, 1936-37, the Wagner-Connery Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act. This says you have a right to union organization everywhere, even in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, even in the Benighted States, even in Indiana, Michigan, Texas, and so forth. You have a right to collective bargaining. You have a right to a union organization, and it recreated the National Labor Relations Board. Now, that's still there, although it has been made into a rather toothless organization. So a new NLRB. 1938, the Wages and Hours Act. Right? Again, you can have a interstate commerce, you can have a minimum wage, and you can have a maximum working day. All right. After the assassination of President Roosevelt in 46 and 47, the reactionaries strike back because, of course, the thing has now passed into the hands of Harry S. Truman, who spends most of his time attacking the New Deal base under various pretexts. And this is now the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Truman did veto it, but he also created a situation where it's kind of like Obama today, where the Republicans and reactionaries were strong enough to get this through. The Taft-Hartley Slave Labor Bill of 1947, it says there are three kinds of labor organizations. There's the closed shop, the union shop, and the open shop. The closed shop is you've got to be a member of the union before you're hired. It says, no, we don't want the closed shop, according to Taft-Hartley. The union shop is okay. In other words, you get the job and then you join the union. But under Taft-Hartley, not only is the closed shop outlawed everywhere, but the union shop is made into a state-by-state sort of Stephen Douglas squatter sovereignty. Instead of establishing the economic rights of America, it divides it up. So the union shop, state by state, and the open shop can be instituted, and that the open shop is what you've got in the southern states and now Indiana and Michigan. This has to be repealed. Roll it back. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're operating today still under the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. It was written by the National Association of Manufacturers, a clique of people who had done everything possible to sabotage the war effort, to maintain their cartel relations with Nazis and other fascists around the world. But now they turn around and they say, well, now that Roosevelt is dead and little Truman of the Ku Klux Klan is in command, we can counterattack. And who were they, right? Taft, this is the guy that Ron Paul admires, right? He says Ron Paul says Taft was Mr. Republican and his great idol. Taft, of course, Taft's isolationism was not isolationism. It was support for Hitler. It was soft on Hitler at the very least, but let Hitler run wild. Taft's dream scenario was that Hitler and Stalin would essentially destroy each other, and that would be that. And then this guy Hartley, who was also a well-known reactionary reprobate. So that went through. The closed shop is outlawed. The union shop is a matter of state-by-state decision, and the open shop is perfectly legalized. So your right to organize, your right to have a union anywhere in the United States under the Wagner Act is taken away. So after the NRA of 33 and the Wagner Act of a few years later, the whole thing is rolled back. So this is Taft-Hartley say, American workers, you won the war, and they did, but we'll now thank you by taking away your union rights. And the effect of this has been to perpetuate the backward social structures of the American South, the inherent oligarchy of this area. It has been passed over by the Homestead Act, Thaddeus Stevens' plan to break up the plantations of the leading Confederates and to do a land reform for the benefit of former slaves. That was rejected in the 1860s and 1870s. And then the union rights were then rolled back in 1947, and the place has continued to be a breeding ground for reactionary views, as we see. The open shop South, the race to the bottom, has been mightily facilitated by this. There's also the thing of cooling off period. So the cooling off period means if you want to have a strike, the federal government can say, no, you have to wait for 90 days. So in the meantime, you're forced to work. What about the freedom to choose there, right? Freedom to choose is a lot of baloney. Do you have the right to organize? Put it in these terms. Now, in order for that to make sense, the tendency, as the NPR people were saying today, that unions are now regarded as a special interest. Unions became a special interest sometime in the late 60s to early 70s. Walter Mondale regarded unions as a special interest. Jimmy Carter certainly regarded unions as a special interest. The choice for union officials, with whom I sympathize, although I want to recommend that they change their practice urgently. You can either be a special interest or you can be a tribune of the people. You want to be a tribune of the people, you've got to put forward demands that reflect the interests of the entire working population, the 98%. And you've got to find organizing forms that allow you to actually bring them to bear in struggle, right? So this is the structural counterweight. Now, that is what the United Front Against Austerity was doing this week. The UFAA intervened, as I said, in New York City, in Washington, in Nebraska, and in Southern California. It's kind of our debut in terms of actual mass interventions. And we went to these actions by the National Nurses United and others. You can read some reports about this. There are some reports and some pictures at againstausterity.org, UFAA website. Go there and take a look. You'll see that these were union actions. The one here in Rockville, Maryland, was representatives of the AFL-CIO warning against the low-wage economy. The National Nurses Union was there. The food and commercial workers were there. Here's the problem: is that you've got to get specific demands. In other words, the benefit of the National Nurses United is that they're calling for, again, the Robin Hood tax. Not a good name. It's too small, and the name is all wrong. But their heart is in the right place. The problem also is it's got to be bigger, and call it a Wall Street sales tax. Then everybody gets it right away. If you call it a Robin Hood tax, Hannity will thank you, Limbaugh will thank you, O'Reilly will thank you. If you call it a Wall Street sales tax, that's going to be much, much harder to demonize because it simply reverses the field. And remember, this is not for the polar bears and the penguins. This is for people. And it's not to fight against global warming. No, it's to save the lives and the futures and the life chances of individuals, their education, their health, their lives, their standard of living. The unions are generally incapable of mounting a criticism of Obama, and what I found is that the demonstration that occurred seemed to have very little stress on the even the Robin Hood tax, even on the Wall Street sales tax. This was not the prominent thing. So you've got to get on the offensive now. Trade union methods will not work in a depression. You've got to go on the offensive and raise these demands. So that means you've got to have the Wall Street sales tax as a demand. Start talking about nationalizing the Federal Reserve. Start talking about the need to force the Federal Reserve to open these credit facilities. As I describe in an article on Tarpley.net, it's time for Bernanke to cough up and to participate in the reconstruction of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut with 0% long-term credit, 50 to 100 years as needed, terra tranches, $1 trillion at a time, not these loans at 4 to 8% or whatever they are. Those will not be enough. Now, a couple of other things. Remember, defense spending can and should be cut, but carefully. You cannot simply say, wipe out all defense industry. That is the only, one of the few areas in the United States of actual advanced technology. So the question with defense industries is their reconversion to mass transit, nuclear energy, and aerospace, in particular the long-term commitment to the moon, Mars, and space stations, production outside of the atmosphere gravity field of the Earth. For the long-term unemployed, we've got to restore 99 weeks and beyond. In other words, open-ended jobless benefits. Those have been around since the NRA. They've been around since actually the Social Security Act of 1935. No entitlement cuts. Obama, take back your unilateral sellout, cave-in, treacherous concession of $200 billion of killer cuts to the fascist Boehner. That is unacceptable. The goal really ought to be to crush and destroy the Republican Party as a national party. The only thing that creates this optical illusion of the Republican Party is tons and tons of money from people like the Koch brothers, Mellon Scaife, and the rest of them. How about a super PAC tax to try to cool some of that off? And it's also important, you can pin the Republicans to the wall by saying, all right, now it's time to normalize the situation of 12 to 13 million undocumented workers. Let's normalize them. Let's regularize everything, legalize everything in a expeditious procedure, 1 or 2 years at the very most. 6 months, 3 months would be certainly better. And remember, the debt ceiling is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment says the debt has to be paid. This is not whether Obama can choose to follow the Constitution, as our reactionary friends are happy to tell us, right? He must follow the Constitution. Pay the national debt and take this weapon away from Boehner. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now, two important items here at the conclusion. First of all, the outlines of Obamagate are already clear, right? We know we're in the second term. Second term means scandals. For Eisenhower, it was Sherman, Adams, and Vicuña Coates. For Nixon, it was Watergate. For LBJ, it was Bobby Baker, Billy Saul Estes, and the Vietnam War. Reagan, it was Iran-Contra. Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, and indeed the other scandals that dogged him. G.W. Bush got hit with Abramoff. with Mark Foley, above all, lost the 2006 election. The Iraq War became a constitutional crisis. Now we have Obama. So what's it going to be? Well, one doesn't know, but the clear outlines are the following. Obamagate bait. Let's go through some Obamagate bait. First of all, if Obama insists on killer cuts, on the grand bargain and the complete sellout, where he really attacks the social safety net, he will antagonize a whole bunch of left-wing Democrats who already don't like him because of his arrogance and his cowardice and his treachery. If he caves on the Bush tax cuts, if he insists on gouging the poor, the sick, the elderly, and so forth, children, then that will weaken him. This is something like this happened to Nixon, right? Nixon was set up for disaster by things called Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, an austerity program, made a lot of people hate him. Secondly, if Obama attacks Syria or even continues to support the death squads as he's doing, now we got the Patriot missile batteries down there, he will be Obamagated, or he can be Obamagated. Look at this now. Suppose the death squads win in Syria. I'm still betting that they won't. I'm against the death squads. Needless to say, I'm against terrorism. But suppose we get the death squads winning the day in Syria. What then? A bloodbath. It will be a bloodbath of Christians, of Maronites, Lebanese, of Melkites, of Syriac Christians, of Orthodox Christians. There will be lots and lots of Christians killed by the death squads. The Alawites will get killed. The Kurds will get killed. The Druzes will die. Foreigners of all kinds, right? We've just heard it. Iran, Russia, Ukraine, anybody else, reporters, journalists, chaos in Syria, a complete bloodbath. That will not play well. I have to speak in these cynical terms because this is the only thing that somebody like Obama would understand. That's bad for your image, Barkey, if all that happens on your watch. And remember, you've got Susan Rice, who's already accused correctly. She's basically convicted of being a party to genocide in the Lakes region of Africa in 1994, 1995. So we're going to get a bunch of bearded terrorists in black on television. Will Ambassador Ford become the Oliver North of this new scandal? Now, Libya in chaos, Benghazi. Well, again, we know what happened in Benghazi, but for the average person, it simply says Al-Qaeda has taken over Libya. That's correct. They have. Egypt. Now, in Egypt, we've got the Muslim Brotherhood with their reactionary constitution. You can see the pattern. In the 1940s, 50s, the question was, who lost China? Well, now the question may become, who lost Libya? Who lost Syria? Who lost Egypt? Obama. And the fact is that this administration has massively supported al-Qaeda terrorism. There's no way around it. They've regarded them, and this has been our denunciation for the last 2 years and more. Al-Qaeda is now the infantry of NATO. This is leading from behind. This is the new policy. Don't you invade, but use proxies, use buck passing, and so forth. So one of the reasons, therefore, and this would be the main one in arguing with somebody like Obama, is to say, look, you go down this path, you insist on this stuff with Syria, this is where you're headed. So time to back off, time to stop supporting those terrorists in Syria. Now, the other thing, of course, a little lightness at the end here. The Viper has been ousted. Susan Rice, the Viper, has now dropped out of consideration for the Secretary of State post. Obama, of course, was fighting harder for Susan Rice than he ever fought for the middle class or working people, the economic rights and entitlements of the American people. He didn't care about that. The right of the oligarch Susan Rice was what he cared about. And we've got all kinds of feminists and White House personnel who are coming out in support of Susan Rice, the Viper. This this face for the United States at the UN was bad enough, but for such a person to aspire to the Secretary of State post, this is a true measure of the degradation of the United States in our time. But now, notice it's not just the three amigos. The three amigos have now reformed. We have McCain, we have Lindsey Graham-Nesty, and we've got the new amiga, right, the senator from New Hampshire there, Ayat. She's now trying to be the third wheel of the tricycle with those two. So, but it's not just right-wing Republicans. There's also the centrist liberal Republican Susan Collins of Maine. But above all, look at some of these others that are considered leftists. Maureen Dowd, is rice cooked? And she doesn't like Susan Rice. We've got a whole bunch of these people. Maureen Dowd. We've also got Samantha Power, having written critically about Susan Rice and her role in Africa. Human Rights Watch, Marshall Malinowski of Human Rights Watch points to the fact that Susan Rice has been in a love affair with Kagame of Rwanda and Museveni of Uganda, and those are the ones who did the genocide in the mid-'90s, and these are now the people behind this M23 attacking in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the question there was, Susan Rice said, "Oh, I know, I'm against the attacks coming from M23, which is obviously sponsored by Rwanda and Uganda. So you're going to condemn the rape, but you're going to refuse to prosecute the rapist, and the rapist in this case is Kagame, joined by Museveni." That's the imperial combination in that part of Africa. So a lot of people who are not right-wing Republicans were against her, so she is now essentially out of the picture. Now, we want her out at the United Nations. We don't want her hanging on there. We do not want her for National Security Director. Now, we're also pointing out in advance the candidacy of Senator Kerry, John Forbes Kerry, the Boston Brahmin, the descendant of one of those oligarchical families who made a deal with the British East India Company in the early 19th century at the very latest. The haughty oligarch Kerry from Skull and Bones is absolutely unacceptable. We don't want him. And we don't want Chuck Hagel, who owes his career to vote fraud. He managed to get into the Senate by owning the machines that were then used to count the votes in, I guess, Nebraska, where he comes from. How about this? Some wag says maybe Obama should put up Valerie Jarrett for Secretary of State, right? You can say, after all, Bush put up Harriet Miers for the Supreme Court, which is in some ways a bigger job. Valerie Jarrett for Secretary of State. But also notice Milbank of Skull and Bones says Rice has an attitude problem. Milbank of Skull and Bones is trying to get Kerry of Skull and Bones into the Secretary of State post. Some say she's got an attitude problem, and she clashed with the Chinese ambassador. She said, "Your position is ridiculous," and the Chinese UN ambassador said, "Watch your language." So good riddance to the Viper, but now keep her out of the White House and keep her out of that UN post. And again, be ready to intervene on the austerity front. Check frequently Webster G. Tarpley on Twitter and tarpley.net, and we'll see you next week. Is cheap. If commentary does not turn into action, it's useless. Less talk, more action. Of course, action can sometimes be also, verbal intervention. It doesn't have to be anything outside of the political sphere, which is where we choose to operate. You've got to go to Twitter. You've got to register for Twitter. Anybody can register for Twitter. Anybody who can read and write can register for Twitter. You get on there and put out tweets saying it's time to free Anhar Kuchneva, time to save her life. She's being held by death squads, the so-called Free Syrian Army. They want $50 million. No, she's got to be freed. And the State Department, and the Quai d'Orsay, and the Foreign Office, and the Farnesina, and you know all the rest of them, the Auswärtiges Amt, all of them have got to be put on the spot. Why are you supporting terrorism? Why don't you speak out against terrorist bandits who are holding hostages? You don't just negotiate with them. You support them. You pay them. And now this week, as of this week, the United States recognizes a new gaggle of terrorists as the rightful government of Syria. That is the Syrian National Coalition, led by this guy Khatib, who is an agent of Royal Dutch Shell, a lobbyist, an executive for Royal Dutch Shell, coming from a family which traditionally serves as stooges and running dogs for the French imperial occupation of Syria, going back to the 1920s and the 1930s. You go to Voltaire Network, Voltaire Net, and you can see pictures of this, the current Khatib's grandfather, I believe, hobnobbing with French imperialist, colonialist, probably proto-fascist generals back in the 1930s. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C. It's the 14th of December, 2012. Two items here at the beginning of the broadcast. We will be dedicating a lot of our time today to the return to the class struggles of the 1930s. We're going to talk about the danger of domestic U.S. fascism and how we have to see this, not so much in Central European terms from the 1930s, but in somewhat different terms, maybe the ones more typical of the U.S. and France in the 1930s. Certainly we've got to talk about union busting, the fascist union busting of Governor Snyder of Michigan and his cabal of Republican state legislators, Tea Party fanatics, agents of the Koch brothers, and so forth, and a union-busting rampage after Wisconsin and Indiana was defeated in Ohio. Notice, could still be defeated in Michigan. Got to talk about the Taft-Hartley Act and how that has to be repealed. And we've got to talk about killer austerity, since Obama has now offered $200 billion more in killer cuts, genocidal austerity, to placate the fascist Boehner. So Obama's also reducing his demand for tax revenue by $200 billion. And I suppose some of that would have come out of the pockets of the super rich. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about essentially the new Czechoslovakia. In other words, what the Nazis... I met her last November at a demonstration, and then this was a demonstration in the square of the railway station. And you recall, I had a chance to say a few words to a crowd of 50 or 60,000 people or more there. She was there covering that demonstration, and Russian-speaking Ukrainian journalist there. Now, she has been kidnapped. I was unaware of this, but Anna Kochneva was apparently kidnapped by the death squads somewhere north of Damascus 6 to 8 weeks ago. This is was something I learned of just yesterday. And if you look at RT, Russia Today, they have made this story prominent. And yesterday, the 13th of December, I put out a whole bunch of tweets and other calls. We have got to do something to save the life of Anhar Kochneva, and also to make people aware this case is not isolated. This is typical. The case is a humanitarian case of the first magnitude, and it shows the terrorist Al-Qaeda essence of the forces that the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice and Fabius and Haig and Cameron are all supporting. They want to install them as the government of Syria. So we've got massive complicity with Al-Qaeda terrorism, and these people are violating all kinds of laws. And as I pointed out on Press TV this week, this is where Obamagate could emerge, but we'll get to that later. Right now, what you've got to do, it's time to act. Mobilization, commentary. So it's time to raise a hue and cry. The NGO community, this case is so extreme that even the NGO community is, to a certain degree, letting itself be heard. Anna Kochnieva was a journalist. She often sent out photo reportages and other stories. Think about it, journalists. That could be you. You want to be held hostage? Remember all these American journalists captured, and what a hue and cry, and what a crime against humanity, and it was. But now, how about Anha Kochnieva? So Amnesty International has done something. You can go to the there's a Save Anhar, ANHAR, Save Anhar, all one word. That's on Twitter. Anhar Kochnieva, Kochneva. You've got to do that right now. Do that in the break, or get your computer while you're listening. Multitask. Send out some tweets. Some of our tweeters, Igor Rasputin has done yeoman service, and some others. But it's time to get busy on that. That is the arena where you can act. Now, more broadly, the same death squad that is holding Anhar Kochnieva, and this is the Free Syrian Army, allegedly now aligned with the Syrian National Coalition, which has been named as the official government of Syria by the NATO imperialists. They have now said that no Iranian, no Ukrainian, no Iranian will be, no Russian, no Ukrainian, no Iranian will be allowed to leave alive. So they want to kill foreign citizens. It's time for those countries to send troops. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis. He did to Czechoslovakia in 1938, within a period of a couple of weeks and months, is being done by NATO to Syria, with the goal being to break up the country. But just remember that once you get something like that, a world war may not be far behind. That was the lesson of 1938 to 1939. This is the main substance of the broadcast. But now, at the beginning, emergency, we have the death squads in Syria apparently advancing. This, again, is not known with any systematic certainty, but the overall impression, trying to cut through the hype and the vacillation of some, that it looks like the death squads have at least made some short-term gains in the last couple of weeks. Let's not think that it's going to end anytime soon. There's still plenty of time for countermeasures. But we've got the death squads. The Free Syrian Army has now kidnapped people and are holding them hostage. They want money, and if not, they're going to execute foreign citizens. And this is the Free Syrian Army that Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Obama, along with Hollande and Cameron and the rest of them, are telling us should be the government of Syria. The death squads should take over the country, they say. Well, let's look at what the death squads are up to. We have Anhar Kochnieva. It's spelled Anhar Kochneva. She is a Ukrainian journalist in Damascus.